Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, ESOP Feasibility Studies, Learning Whether and How an ESOP Works for Your Company, sponsored by GBQ Capital Park Advisors. Now I'd like to introduce GBQ's Directors of Valuation and ESOP Advisory, Brian Bornino and Joe Borowski, to start today's webinar.
Thanks, Demetra, and thanks everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Joe Borowski. I'm a partner in our ESOP and Valuation Advisory practice. I've been with GBQ about 20 years now, which means I've been working with ESOP companies for about 20 years. I help companies form ESOPs and execute ESOP transactions, and then I work with many of our 100 or so annual ESOP clients doing their annual valuation. So Brian, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself and talk more about our group.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Excited to be with you today for an hour to talk about ESOPs, one of our favorite topics. I've also worked at GBQ for about 20 years and have been involved with the ESOP advisory industry for about 30 years, a frequent speaker and author on topics related to ESOPs. Been involved with a couple thousand ESOP projects throughout the course of my career, so definitely something that's kind of near and dear to my heart. So definitely excited to be with you today to talk about ESOPs. To maybe set the tape, I'm going to set the stage and go through, give you a little bit of commercial on our group, and then Joe will kick off the content. But really, the purpose of this session today is taking a deeper dive into an ESOP feasibility study. If you've been on any of our webinars in the past on ESOPs, we've done a lot of ESOP 101 and what are the tax advantages, what are the business advantages, those sorts of things. But we often reference, a first step might be to do this feasibility study. Today, we're really planning on taking a deeper dive into what is included in that feasibility study and what does it look like. So if you're in the position where you're kind of intrigued by an ESOP, you've done initial learning and ESOP seems interesting to you, and you're trying to decide if you want to take the first step, that you're in the right place. So our the topics today, we are going to I'll do a quick commercial. As I mentioned, this is primarily about feasibility studies, but we will do what I'm going to call a crash course on ESOPs, just for those who maybe aren't as familiar. That might be maybe 15 minutes or so, just talking about what an ESOP is, how it works, the advantages. We'll walk a little bit through the ESOP transaction process, what a feasibility study is, and really the whole back half of this session, maybe 20 or 30 minutes, we wanted to really walk you through an actual feasibility study we did for a client and kind of show you what's included and how it helped the client, make a decision to move forward with an ESOP. So that's kind of the goal today. Quick commercial on our practice for those who don't know. We do have a national ESOP advisory practice. We've been involved with a couple thousand ESOP projects during the course of our careers. We do about 125 ESOP projects annually. About 100 of those are annual ESOP valuations. And then there's another 20 or 25 ESOP transactions that we might be involved with in any given year. We're real active with the ESOP Association, the NCEO, OEOC, a lot of the local and national organizations that promote ESOPs, and you can see us sponsoring and speaking at pretty much any and all of their webinars and seminars. In terms of services with ESOPs, we do a lot of ESOP pre-transaction planning, which is kind of what we're talking about today, feasibility studies. Also help companies implement ESOPs, kind of quarterback these transactions. We work for companies and business owners as well as ESOP trustees, who would be the buyers. And then we do annual valuations and ongoing consulting work for existing ESOPs as well. So kind of a broad range of ESOP services. Here's a little smattering of some of our clients. We don't have to go through that. These are our active or recent ESOP transactions we've been involved with. There's about 20 of them on the slide. These are all either active or closed in 2025. You'll see a mix of industries, a mix of geographies, and also a mix of whether we're advising the trustee or the company / sellers as well. So it's a nice mix of ESOP work. You can obviously see we're very active in this space. Here's the team. won't necessarily spend any time on that. Joe and I are the two we'll be presenting to you today. And before we get started, I did want to kick off. We have our first code word. I know you have to get CPE. We need to keep track of these words and do a poll. So the first code word is employee. I'll let Demetra set that up.
While we're waiting for you to fill in the code words too, or fill in the survey question again, as Demetra mentioned, feel free to put questions in the chat box. We might not answer them right away if it's something we'll cover later. If we run out of time, we'll certainly, follow up with you after the presentation to answer those questions.
Okay. Very good. Let us move along. So I think we're going to start off with kind of this crash course. Joe, do you want to take it away?
Yep, sounds good, Brian. Yeah, as Brian mentioned, we do these webinars all the time. We did one not too long ago that was what I'd call an ESOP 101 presentation, where we talked about, the basics of an ESOP, some of the nuances of an ESOP. You could certainly fill an hour or more talking about, basics of an ESOP, and we obviously don't have time to cover everything here. And still cover our feasibility study. So we're going to do this fast, but just wanted to give, a little bit of background for those of you that are new to ESOPs, so you're not totally left in the dust when we move forward to kind of the more advanced ESOP feasibility stuff. If we lose anybody on this, in this presentation, I'm always happy to offer, we're happy to have a conversation on ESOP basics, offline another time. Feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is in the back.
Oh, Joe, can I mention one thing before we get started? One thing I forgot to mention to everybody. The timing of this webinar was intentional. As you will see in about 7 or 8 or 10 slides, a typical ESOP transaction takes 4 or 5 or 6 months to execute, which means if you are interested in pursuing an ESOP and hopefully having that in place by year end or for 1/1/26, now is really the time, and it's almost like last call. So if the thought is we'd love to have an ESOP in place by the end of the year or effective starting next year, you're pretty much in the month where you would have to make a decision to move forward. So we did want to, that's why we scheduled this at this time. Sorry, Joe, go ahead.
No, that's a great point, Brian. Thanks. So real quick, and to start us off, you've probably, a lot of you, if you're on this, interested in joining this webinar, probably heard the word ESOP mentioned before, and kind of, why do people choose to form an ESOP? Why do people do an ESOP transaction? If we could summarize kind of why ESOPs exist in, 4 different bullets here, it's really, these are the reasons why sellers choose an ESOP and why company leaders, choose to go this route. First and foremost, an ESOP works well when the sellers and leaders of the company want to keep the company independent, aren't interested in selling to PE or, strategic buyer, some outside party, because they want to keep the company independent, preserve its legacy, et cetera, et cetera. That's certainly a main consideration. Another top reason why companies choose the ESOP route, there are many tax advantages to an ESOP transaction and to an ongoing ESOP company. We'll get into those shortly. The biggest is, as you see there in bullet number 2, there's a way to create a company that doesn't pay federal income taxes every year. So I'll tease that benefit, which we'll talk more in detail about here shortly. Reason 3, it's a liquidity tool for owners, for sellers. Maybe there's a seller that wants to sell and get liquidity for their stock, but the rest of the shareholder team isn't ready to do so. So an ESOP could be a path to liquidity for that one shareholder, or it could be a path to liquidity for all those shareholders. And not only is it a path to liquidity, but often, as we'll talk about here, an ESOP transaction, it being an internal transaction, in some regards, typically quicker, higher chance of closure, than maybe some other types of transactions out there. And really the 4th reason why people choose an ESOP, and really is a reason that exists in almost all of our ESOP transactions we go through. Is there's a seller or leaders or people driving the bus from the company side want to reward their employees and key management, and they think, hey, these people have helped build the success of our company. I want to reward them with true ownership in the company, and ESOP is a great vehicle for doing. So how does an ESOP work? A little background here. So an ESOP transaction, it's a true transaction. It's selling shareholders negotiating with the ESOP, an ESOP trustee leading that negotiation, who's the fiduciary responsible for getting the right purchase price on behalf of the employee participants. Um, so it's a negotiated transaction, it's a regulated transaction. The selling shareholders, when they sell stock to the ESOP, if it's a big enough transaction, and it's often 100% transaction, as I've teased and we'll get into here shortly, what will happen is the sellers, in a big transaction like that, where it's, most of the companies being sold to the ESOP, these sellers will walk away with cash up front, with that cash either coming from the company or provided by a bank. And then the selling shareholders would finance the rest of that transaction for anything above the purchase price that can't be met by a bank or the cash on the company's books. And then we get into the feasibility study, certainly we'll be able to, show the visual of what that looks like, the timing of when the proceeds, go to the selling shareholders. Um, the sellers do receive interest on anything they lend to the company in a transaction. And we'll certainly get into what that interest can look like, and also what exists outside of interest if the sellers, instead of interest, are interested in taking what's called warrants, as an alternative, which provides them for, with some upside in an ESOP transaction. And I'll talk about that shortly. Those last three bullets kind of discuss what happens after an ESOP transaction. So when a company sells to an ESOP, those shares do not get allocated to all employees right away. It's not the kind of thing where divvy up the stock, give it to all the employees that exist now, and then all of a sudden, voila, they're all shareholders in the company. The shares sit in a pool and are allocated to employees over a period of time, and usually over a long period of time. We're talking 10, 15, 20 years. So your employee that joins the company 10 years after an ESOP transaction, 15 years after a transaction, in all likelihood will still get stock, that comes from that pool. And then when your employees retire or leave the company, there's an obligation that those shares are repurchased by the company. They are often also instead repurchased by the ESOP. So your employees, after they've been with the company a little bit of time, will accrue shares, and then there's an obligation that those shares are then bought back by the company when they leave, retire, or when they diversify out of their ESOP retirement account. Then the last thing there, with the ESOP transaction being an internal transaction, not a lot changes in the day-to-day management, the running of the company after a transaction. If you think about what happens after a PE sale or a strategic sale, when there's new bodies that come in that are running the company, there's big changes to how the company's run, big changes to leadership, things like that. That doesn't have to happen in an ESOP transaction, and often does not happen. Where the sellers or the company leaders that were running the company before the transaction, still run the company after the transaction. So there's a lot of benefits. And I mentioned kind of the four reasons why, main reasons why companies sell to an ESOP. There's a lot of financial and non-financial benefits to ESOP, having an ESOP company and selling the stock to a company through an ESOP transaction. Just to fully, we won't go through all these bullets here, but really just to talk about some of the main ones, and this would be a good time to talk about the first one here, which I teased earlier. There is a way through an ESOP transaction to create a company that doesn't pay federal income taxes. And how that works is, I'm sure many on this webinar are familiar. In an S corp, the tax liability of a company is passed through to the shareholders. Well, an ESOP is a tax exempt entity. So if you have a 100% ESOP owned S corporation company, when that tax liability gets passed through to the shareholders, the ESOP being tax exempt, you've created, as long as you meet certain regulations and pass certain tests, you've created a company that doesn't pay federal income taxes. That is a huge tax benefit, and something where when we're talking to sellers or company leaders, when they think about why an ESOP might make sense, this idea of not having 20, 30, 40% of the company's cash flows or income, paid to the government every year in taxes. If you're able to save that, it could amount to millions of dollars a year in savings, and savings that don't go away, that happen every year the company makes income, that can lead to significant competitive advantages for the company, has led to many advantages for our ESOP clients. And those tax savings, in all likelihood, more than make up for the cost of doing an ESOP transaction and also the ongoing costs of running an ESOP company, the administration that goes into place when you have an ESOP company. Brian will show that visually later when we walk through a feasibility study, kind of the mechanics behind it, and really kind of the dollars that exist in savings for a company that sells to an ESOP through 100% transaction while structured as an S corp. One other thing I might mention on here too is another financial benefit, is you'll see one of the bullets here, sellers participating in the ESOP. ESOPs are attractive to sellers who maybe have 5, 10 more years of runway left before retirement, because you could sell to an ESOP, still run the company as a leader of the company, and at the same time accrue shares within the ESOP, potentially incur or receive management incentive units, or kind of benefits that exist to management of ESOP owned companies. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, when sellers sell to an ESOP and they finance the transaction, they can receive interest on that financing. They can, instead of interest, receive what are called warrants, where they get kind of equity options on that provide an additional benefit when those options are cashed in, which usually happens 10, 12, 13, 14 years down the road, on the future value of the company at that time. So it's a way to sell equity in the company today for fair market value, receive a fair purchase price, while at the same time receiving some economic benefits down the road if the company does well. And if you're a seller and you're going to be running the company, or working with the company, you're in a position to make sure the company does well. Maybe to hit one other non-financial benefit, one of the fourth bullet down there, flexibility. There's a lot of customization that goes into an ESOP transaction. When you're selling your company and looking for a third-party external buyer, the terms, the mechanics, the structure of that transaction is often dictated by what the buyer wants to pay, or how the buyer wants the transaction to work. In an ESOP transaction, there's a lot of flexibility there. And when you're selling to an ESOP trustee, it's the job really of the sellers to craft that transaction and say, okay, I'm interested in selling X percent, or I'm interested in bank financing or not bank financing. I guess just to kind of summarize, there's a number of options that exist in an ESOP transaction, and that flexibility is very attractive to selling shareholders. And it's also why this feasibility study that Brian's going to get into here shortly, is the step where you decide on a lot of those different options. Brian, anything you want to mention here on the benefits of these? There's obviously a lot of bullets on this page.
Right. I know we cover these oftentimes in our kind of intro to ESOP sessions, so I can't spend too much time on it, I don't think. I guess the only one I might highlight, and this would be in the non-financial category, is the low transaction risk. I just wanted to elaborate on that. We've been involved with lots of transactions selling a company to a third party, be it a strategic or a private equity buyer. And I don't know what the success rate on those are in terms of the deal actually closing, but it's way less than it is with an ESOP transaction. I mean, we may be, say, if you get an LOI from a third party buyer or a PE firm, you might have a 50% chance, or 2/3 chance of getting to the finish line. If an ESOP, if you decide that you want to sell to an ESOP, I mean, it's in our experience, it's a 99% success rate. Basically, there aren't as many hurdles to getting an ESOP deal done. So I guess that's something I'd like to point out.
Yeah, that's a good point, Brian. Yeah, so kind of real quickly, what makes sense for a good ESOP candidate, both from the seller perspective and also the type of company that makes for a good ESOP company. And a lot of these bullets are probably pretty obvious to you as you hear us talk about an what ESOP transaction looks like. Um, but as the initially as the seller selling shareholders, there's some desire to keep the company independent, not have new leadership brought in, keep the company name, things like that. The sellers that want to reward employees, a seller that's not going anywhere maybe for a little bit of time, because in a ESOP transaction, again, you're receiving some of the purchase price up front, but you're going to be paid the bulk of the purchase price, or at least a lot of the purchase price, over a period of time. So it's sellers usually want to be with the company, either on the board or actively running the company during that period while their notes getting paid down. So kind of a leader that's not, or a seller that doesn't want to participate in that transition, just wants to get their purchase price and walk away, right after a transaction, isn't really a good fit for an ESOP. Also from seller considerations, things like that. Industries, some industries out there are companies that are willing to pay big premiums on a company's ongoing value. Maybe it's because it eliminates a competitor, or there's a lot of synergies in combining two companies. An ESOP doesn't bring any synergies to the table because it doesn't bring any outside leadership, things like that. So if you're in an industry, and this happens a lot with construction, professional service firms, many other industries as well, if there's not a buyer out there that's going to give you some huge purchase price, some big premium of what the value of the business might be to you, an ESOP could be a good candidate and a good exit strategy for you. As far as company characteristics, we have companies that are all industries, all sizes. As you see on here, even companies that are, worth $1 million or $2 million can be good fits for an ESOP because the tax savings more than make up for the administrative costs. We also have many large, complex companies that are ESOP owned as well. But you do need a strong management team, especially if the selling shareholders are interested in stepping away, soon after a transaction. It's helpful to have predictable, steady cash flows. In an ESOP transaction, you're levering up the company, so you need a company that's going to be able to pay that debt. And you have confidence that the performance after a transaction is going to be stable enough that you can repay those those seller notes and also the bank debt. And you get the most bang for the buck in an ESOP transaction when you have employees that really care about being at the company. They maybe employees that have been with the company for a long time, plan to be at the company for a long period of time, because the ESOP shares are allocated over a long period, like I said, 10, 15 years. So if you have kind of a transient workforce where a lot of your employees come and go within a couple years, they're not really going to be there long enough to gain enough ESOP shares, and really get that benefit that exists in a good ESOP company, where you've got those employees that are owners, act like owners, and want to make the company better, improve company performance. So yeah, next slide here. So, I mean, there's all sorts of surveys that are done of ESOP companies where they interview leaders and the workforce at the company and say, hey, are you happy with the ESOP? Are you glad you did an ESOP? And really, for the most part, and we see this with our client base, if you have the right advisors going into an ESOP transaction, if you do an ESOP for the right reasons, And ESOP's usually a successful, outcome for not only the sellers, but the company because of all those tax benefits. And then really for your employees who, in all likelihood haven't given up anything in an ESOP transaction, but are now, owners of the company. So it's really a way to, set up your company for long-term success, reward your employees, and hopefully have a really good outcome for everybody. Got our second code word here, advantage. So please enter that into your survey. And then I think we're moving on to the next section.
Give you a minute to do that poll question. Okay. Yeah, so I think we're going to, Joe, thanks for the crash course on ESOPs. That was we do full 1 hour and 2 hour webinars on ESOPs, and Joe kind of did the 15 to 20 minute Cliff Notes version. So hopefully that was helpful to everybody. Wanted to briefly just talk about the ESOP transaction process, and then we will talk a little bit about feasibility studies, and then we'll go through our case study. So let's do that. So as Joe alluded to, an ESOP transaction is a transaction. I mean, there are sellers and buyers, and the selling shareholders typically have advisors like their accounting firm. There would be an ESOP attorney who would help. There'll be a record keeper, and ultimately there'll be what we like to just informally call a deal quarterback, but it's really a financial advisor / valuation advisor to the company, which is the role we often play. So we're basically quarterbacking the transaction and helping you find all these other advisors, and assembling the team. There's also going to be a buy side to the transaction. An ESOP trustee is appointed or hired, who's basically a fiduciary, and their job is to negotiate a fair price for the employees in this transaction. That trustee will hire an independent valuation firm of their choice, and the ESOP attorney of their choice to advise them on the transaction. So there's the folks advising the company and the sellers, and then there's the folks advising the ESOP trustee. And negotiations will take place, and ultimately, hopefully, a transaction that everybody's happy with is kind of formed in the end. And that's typically what happens. Oftentimes, and I know we'll talk about this in the feasibility piece, but the fact that GBQ is frequently serving as the valuation firm for trustees gives us a lot of good insight into the hot buttons for ESOP trustees. And also because we work with ESOP companies throughout their life cycle, I think we can spot issues that that may be issues down the road during an initial transaction. And I think that helps us make us a little bit better in structuring these deals on the front end, basically, and putting ESOP transactions together that kind of work for all parties.
There's a lot of people we compete with, or other people that quarterback transactions where maybe they're investment bankers that do ESOP transactions and non-ESOP transactions. They might have a lot of deal experience helping companies become ESOP owned. I mean, I think we benefit from, like I mentioned at the beginning, there's some ESOP companies we've worked with for 20 years. We've seen the issues that can arise in mature ESOP companies. We've seen the issues that can arise in any company when you're working with them for 10, 15, 20 years. And so if there's anything we can do on the front end when we set up the transaction to help make them get through those challenges better down the road, we're in good position to do that from having seen just about anything over our 20 plus years.
Well, that's a good point. Another thing, I probably should have added a slide on this, but I will mention these transactions are reviewed by the Department of Labor. I mean, this is an ERISA plan. An ESOP's an ERISA plan, and the Department of Labor looks at these transactions, reviews them, audits them. There are lawsuits involving ESOP transactions that were deemed to be kind of abusive, basically. And ultimately, what they're typically looking for is that the ESOP did not overpay and that the transaction was fair to the ESOP. And we've actually been hired by trustees and other firms to, help analyze transactions and really defend against a DOL attack. So I think we have our pulse on what's inbounds and what's out of bounds on an ESOP transaction, basically. So in terms of our transaction process, this is probably the process that, a similar process that a lot of advisors might use. But, really step one for a business owner is just education, what you're doing today. Let's learn about ESOPs. Let's go to seminars, webinars. Let's read articles, look on the internet, talk to business owners who have ESOPs, and, just gather some information about ESOPs. Once you get to the point of, okay, this ESOP thing is interesting, typically the first formal step is a feasibility study, which is what we're about to talk about, and Joe's about to introduce. But it's really a low cost study to help you understand what an ESOP transaction is going to look like in for your business. And if after that study you look at the study, realize that the ESOP is going to make a lot of sense for you and your company, then step three would be, okay, let's implement the transaction, let's execute the deal, and then we would sort of quarterback the deal from there and get the ESOP implemented, basically. So that is kind of the timeline. We're always happy to talk to anybody, free of charge, basically, about ESOPs and how they work, their advantages, disadvantages, all that. So that step one is free. Just please use us as a resource. Step two, there is a cost to that, and that's what we're talking about today. But it's certainly a good investment because it really models out what a transaction would look like, and then you'd want to do step one and two before obviously committing to step three.
Brian, go maybe skip ahead. And actually, why don't you can skip this slide too? It's an ugly one. So the analogy when we're talking about this step two, as Brian mentioned in the three-step process, this feasibility study, which again is the heart of this presentation. The analogy we use to describe what this study does or what it is the blueprint of the transaction, or the blueprint of the house. And so, obviously when you're building a house, when you're building a structure, you design all the features for that house, you put the blueprint together, and then you go hire all the parties, the contractors, and everyone to execute that blueprint and build the house. The feasibility study is the blueprint for the transaction. Where we model out, all aspects of the transaction. We talked about the customization that exists in an ESOP, all the different routes you can go. The feasibility study tackles all those different customization options so that by the time we're done with the feasibility study, hopefully the sellers know exactly what type of transaction they want to do, what type of purchase price they can expect in an ESOP transaction, when they get their money, things like that. Brian, you mentioned earlier that, our close rates on ESOP transactions are really high, really for everyone, but especially, for us, 90–95%. And maybe to toot our horn a little bit, I think it's because we evaluate everything at this feasibility study stage. And then if we find out through that stage that maybe an ESOP won't work, that happens in that stage, not the later stage where all those parties have been hired. You've gone through a transaction discussion with the trustee, things like that. Just like when you're building a building, you don't want to hire the contractors when you're not sure exactly what the house is going to look like. You don't want to hire the parties in an ESOP transaction until you know exactly what type of transaction you want to do. So this slide here's all the questions that our ESOP feasibility study answers. Over time, as we've gone through transactions with buyers and we get these questions, or even before we start the process, these are the questions that sellers ask us or their advisors ask us. What I want to do an ESOP and I want to know what price I'm going to get, et cetera, et cetera. And so we've intentionally built this study to answer all of these questions, and then we modify the study over time, to make sure we're still answering all the questions that come up, as we're presenting this feasibility study. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, when we've presented this study, the report, the presentation at the end of this process, we want the sellers to be able to say, okay, this looks great. Let's do an ESOP transaction. Or, okay, thanks for modeling it out, but actually, the purchase price isn't as high as I think. I might be able to get another transaction, or, hey, I'm going to wait for a little bit before I do this, et cetera, et cetera. So this feasibility study should be the only thing a sellers need to do in order to make that go or no go decision. One other thing to maybe mention on here is, where I think our feasibility studies are even more robust than just about anyone else's, and we have a slide on it later. We focus a lot on the valuation part of a feasibility study, and maybe that's because that's our background as valuation folks. But really, that top left question is the most important question to most buyers, or sorry, most sellers. They are interested in an ESOP, but only if they're going to get the right price, if the proceeds are going to be, above a certain level. So as we'll show later, we do a full valuation. We have a full, it's often 50 slide or more slide deck where we do the entire valuation work we would do if we were supporting the trustee on the other side of a transaction. And so that way, we're confident we've got the value right in a feasibility study, because that valuation informs a lot of the rest of the feasibility study, when you get your money, how the company pays back the debt, things like that. So without further ado, I think we're probably ready to get into the actual case study here, but we've got our next CP code word, feasibility. So please put that in your survey.
Yep, I think our pacing is really good. We a lot of times you go to these webinars and there's a case study, and presenter gets to the case study with 2.5 minutes left. We wanted to make sure we didn't do that, so we have we got 20 or 25 minutes left in the seminar, so hopefully there's plenty of time to go through this case study.
And these are always, and we always talk about our feasibility study in presentations, Brian, but it's hard to talk about conceptually. It's much easier to actually show you our work. So we're proud to do that today and kind of show what actually went into a feasibility study here as part of this case study.
Yeah, and I guess just to set the table here, so our typical feasibility studies are about, and I know volume isn't everything, but just to give you a concept, they're about 50 slides of modeling out the transaction, and then probably another 50 slides of evaluation analysis. So this is like 100 slides or 100 pages of feasibility analysis that would typically come. What this case study does is we've identified, I think I've extracted like 12 key slides from a recent feasibility study we actually did for a client. So these are all live numbers for a real client. That's obviously not going to identify the client, but yeah, these are like 12 key slides. So what we're going to do is just sort of present the feasibility study results to you as if you were the client who hired us to do this feasibility study. So that's kind of what we're going to do here. I guess setting the table real quickly, just to paint a picture for the story. This study was done for a contractor in a small rural Ohio town, although they do work kind of all throughout Ohio and in a couple other states as well. The business was owned by one individual who was 52 years old. You can see some financial metrics there. It was about 35 million in revenue, 4 or 5 million in EBITDA, which is basically pre-tax cash flow. Long-time family-owned business. The owner's father started the business, way back when. Like I mentioned, in a small community, the employees, they have a lot of long-time employees. The employees are treated like family. They're like extended family to the owner. Very positive culture. Just a great business basically. And what the business owner was considering is they're thinking about how they're going to transition ownership someday. Some of their key considerations were, number one, let me mention one thing. They were persistently approached by strategic buyers and private equity. So that, naturally you get curious a little bit and say, well, maybe I should sell. they did explore a transaction with a private equity firm a few years back. Um, and quickly learned that that was not what they wanted to do, because they were not willing to compromise the company's legacy, the culture, the community involvement. Um, they just wanted the business to continue as it always has, basically. So kind of decided that a private equity or a strategic wasn't the way to go. And what they were really interested in is the business continuing to operate as it always has, somehow rewarding key management and employees, and being a tool to attract and retain new employees. This is a business owner, like many other business owners. He really hates paying tax, right? So this the tax-free element was very attractive to him. Also, a very growth-minded CEO. So he quickly put two and two together and said, hey, if I'm not paying a couple $1 million in tax a year, that's more equipment I can buy, more people I can hire, more growth I can have, that sort of thing. So he was very attracted by the competitive advantage that being tax-free would provide. He wants to continue to work for 5 to 10 more years. He wants to be the CEO. He wants to run the business. So he has some runway. As Joe mentioned, that's a common trait for a lot of business owners who want to sell to an ESOP. He's certainly interested in a fair price, not a greedy guy, but doesn't want to give the business away either. And, being as he wanted to work for another 10 years, he was hoping to have some upside in the transaction as well. So that kind of paints the picture. That is, there is a particular company this relates to, but I can think of a lot of clients that fit this description, basically, where it's a family culture, but business owner who wants to take care of their employees, all of that. So it's this is a typical ESOP success story of, and this is a typical company where an ESOP made a lot of sense. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So we are going to go ahead and get into the transaction. This is a quick overview. I don't want to get hung up on this slide because there are slides following this that support each one of these, each of these numbers. But just to give you a quick snapshot here, it was our opinion the company was worth $25.7 million. That was our midpoint of our value range. So that's what we modeled the transaction after, was a $25 to $26 million price. This is a transaction that the seller was going to finance. They decided not to get a bank involved. So it's going to be 100% seller financed. The total proceeds that the seller will receive from the $25.7 million purchase price, plus the interest he'll get on the notes, plus some warrants, which we'll talk about in a bit, is about $43 million. So this $25 or $26 million company, he'll ultimately get $43 million for over time. That he will get a 6% interest on his notes. He's going to get warrants of 15%, which basically means when the notes are repaid, he'll get a second bite of the apple and be able to sell his warrants for whatever 15% of whatever the company's worth in, I think it was in 12 years in this case. We modeled that to be a IRR, or return on his seller note, between 8 and 9%, which is very reasonable. He probably actually could have got higher than that, but didn't want to burden the company with too high of an interest rate. So he was happy with the 8 or 9%. We put in a stock appreciation rights plan for key management. I guess a couple other things. The timeline was we were going to try and close this 4 months after the feasibility study is completed, which is a little aggressive, but we did get it done. We estimated transaction fees for all parties. Remember, those 7 or 8 parties who were involved in the transaction, including us, to be 400 to 600,000 or 700,000 in fees. I think it actually ended up being around 500 or so. So we were kind of right on point with our budget. And this transaction, the way it's structured, where they're going to be 100% ESOP owned, is going to save the company $14 million in tax over the 12-year loan period, and then more than that over time as the income tax savings doesn't go away. It just continues. So that's a quick snapshot. Now we're going to sort of dive into each piece of basically the key slides, and kind of present you the each of these as if we were presenting it to the client. And first off is the
And
valuation.
Brian, you
Maybe some of
mentioned,
the,
if you go back to the last slide,
yes, sir.
the slide's probably mistyped. It says transaction overview. This is the summary of our feasibility study. You mentioned that the transaction fees were in line kind of with what we had estimated in the feasibility study. Is it fair to say that really a lot of these terms, probably as you finally closed that transaction, ended up very close to what we estimated in this feasibility study, right?
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, the price ended up being between 26 and 27 million. It was a little higher. The company had performed well and just negotiated a good price, and but pretty much everything else was very, very close to what we predicted. You're right. Good point.
Yeah. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, and as Brian mentioned, there's a 50 slide or usually about 50 slide deck where we actually do a full valuation of the company. This is just the one summary slide that really shows the entire valuation. You see the total transaction value all the way at the bottom there. Um, we because so much is based on the value, the purchase price in a transaction. It's important to fully vet that out. And the way we do it is we do a valuation analogous to if we had been hired by the other side, the ESOP trustee, to support them and negotiate the transaction from the buy side. So we use the same methods. We do, full valuation methods. The three we used here are very common valuation methods, and the ones that we use in mini ESOP, valuations. We ultimately, by having three methods close to one another, we felt very confident on that enterprise value. You think about an enterprise value being the debt-free, cash-free value of the company, and ultimately you're selling stock. So that's why we're then adding back the cash, other non-operating assets. They were distributing some cash at close, so that you see that subtracted, but then added at the bottom. In ESOP valuation, there's always I shouldn't say always, but really in almost all of our valuations and any other valuation done by other firms, there's a small discount for lack of marketability that valuators apply just to account for the risk that the company can't buy back the stock when people retire. So it ends up being a small reduction in value, which ultimately leads into a small reduction in the purchase price as it's being negotiated. Brian mentioned this had a management incentive plan, a SAR plan, that almost always has a dilutive impact to the value as a evaluator looks at it. So ultimately, we walked through what we think step by step what a valuation firm would do in valuing this transaction that we're proposing, and that we think gives us a lot of clarity into what ultimately the purchase price will look like and the eventual transaction proceeds in a transaction. So hopefully, there's no surprises later after going through this feasibility study once we get into negotiation phase.
Yeah, and just to maybe elaborate on that, so just focusing on the bottom line here, our conclusion was that we thought the total transaction value was, 23.8 million to 27.5 million or whatever at the bottom here, with a midpoint of 25.7. So we modeled the whole transaction off of a $25.7 million purchase price. Keep in mind, again, the trustee is going to hire their own valuation firm that's going to do their own valuation that we won't get to see and you won't get to see. Only the trustee gets to see it. And then a negotiation will take place. And the whole purpose of us doing this valuation is to determine what we think the company's worth and also predict what we think the other valuation person is going to think the company's worth, so we can adequately predict what the purchase price the final negotiated purchase price might be. So anyway, 25.7 million is the key number here. Kind of moving on, then we typically will present, okay, when do I get my money? And in this case, if you recall, there's actually no bank involved. They just decided, since he's going to work another 10 years anyway, he might as well play banker and pay himself the interest rather than have a bank involved, and he didn't need too much cash up front anyway. And it also makes the transaction cheaper. So he decided to, which there are plenty of good reasons to go to a bank and get some cash up front, but he chose not to do that. which is fine. So he got his 3.2 million cash at closing, which was the excess cash on the balance sheet. That 3.2 plus the 22.5 of principal in that first column adds up to the 25.7 purchase price. So ultimately, that's the timing of when he gets the purchase price. It was a 12-year note. There's interest in that next column, which was, again, if you remember, at 6%. And then there's that warrant cash out, which, if you recall, we negotiated a 15% warrant position that gets cashed out once the loan's repaid. This is a total estimate of what that might be worth. I mean, we're projecting and predicting what 15% of the company might be worth in 12 years, but we make a reasonable estimate. There's about 8 million or so. And the 8 million of warrants plus the 9 million of interest is another 17 or 17.5 million dollars of proceeds that they'll ultimately be receiving over time, adding up to the total of the 43 million. So, after seeing this slide, any business owner should be able to know, how much we think they can get and when they might get it. Does that make sense?
8.3 million, Brian. I mean, we actually in our modeling model out what we think the value of the company will be each year going out that far. So that 8.3 million reflects 15% of what the value of the company, we think the company value will be. Now it's obviously a guess, and I'm sure it'll be, quite a bit different, 13 years from now. But that modeling out that future value helps us show what the warrants could be. And it also helps us, as we'll show in a later slide, kind of what the benefits to the employees would be as they're getting these shares over time, what their account balance might grow to based on that future value of the company.
Yep. And peeking at the time, I see we have about 6 minutes to cover maybe about 8 slides. So what I'm going to do is just show you the slides and give you the key takeaway from each one. So those warrants are very valuable to a business owner. We oftentimes will do something like this where there's like a matrix of, there's a trade-off of, which are you willing to trade some of your interest for more or less warrants? So we'll oftentimes construct a table like this where we say, and in this case, he wanted 6% interest, which we thought could get him about 15% warrants and still yield a fair rate of return. So this is some of the structuring and flexibility that we can build into a transaction. We always will map out cash flows to the company to make sure the company can actually afford the transaction. In this case, those debt payments that we modeled out are about 2.6 million a year. That's the blue bar here. Their cash flow is more like 3 or 4 or 5 million a year, growing. So the cushion is really represented by the green. And we always have a slide like this to make sure that we're not structuring a deal that's too tight. For example, if we had an 8-year loan or 7-year loan or a 10-year loan, maybe they could have afforded it, but the cash flow might be tight. And if you stress tested it, we're a little nervous that maybe in a bad year there'd be a repayment issue. So we try to create a long enough loan to have a good cushion. We do point out, though, like in year 7, in theory, if you were to reinvest all those cushions every year and pay down the debt early, which you're allowed to do, you could actually pay this transaction off in 7 years. So, and a lot of our clients will prepay the deal and get it paid off quicker, but we always like to structure a transaction with enough cushion so the company can, breathe, and if there's a recession, we don't suffer, and all of that.
And 7 years is pretty quick to pay off, 100% of the value of a company. But remember, if as in this case, it's 100% S corp, ESOP transaction, all those tax savings accrue to the company's balance sheet and are available to pay off this debt. So that's often why, the debt can be paid off a lot faster in an ESOP transaction.
So in an ESOP feasibility study, we'll always quantify the tax savings. In this case, we calculated that to be 14.6 million over the 12 years. And keep in mind that the tax savings don't actually stop after 12 years. If you do the math on that, depending if you want to compare that 14 million to the $25 million purchase price or the $43 million of total payments required, what this basically means is the government is funding anywhere between a third and over half of this transaction, by way of the tax benefits that they grant to ESOP companies, which are very unique to ESOP companies. So this is why an ESOP always blows away a management buyout or other types of internal transactions from a financial perspective, because the tax advantage is just so compelling. And I know we got to move quickly, so I'll just hit a couple other slides quickly. We will always project out what account balances might be for typical employees. So here's an example where we modeled out kind of who gets what inside of an ESOP. And here we have a $100,000 a year employee. And this gives an idea of what their account balance might grow to over time. This is often helpful to the client so they can discover or confirm that the ESOP is going to be a meaningful benefit to their employees. This we can just do quickly, but this is what the transaction cap table looked like after the deal. Keep in mind, it's actually 100% ESOP owned, because the warrants and the SARs are synthetic equity, not real equity. So it's still 100% owned, but on a fully diluted basis. This is kind of what the cap table looked like. I'm just going to skip this, but you can certainly look at it if you request the slides. But this is kind of how the stock appreciation rights worked for key management. And at the end of the day, if the company hit certain targets, they were able to grant SARs to key employees. Those appreciated for 5 years and then were cashed out for whatever the value was in 5 years. So whatever that appreciation was over a 5-year period, that's what was paid to employees, and that's this $38,000 in year one. And this is way too much to go over, but we will quantify to key employees. A lot of times there's 1 or 2 or 3 key employees who we want to really make sure are taken care of, and we'll create slides like this where we show their salary, the benefit from the SARs, how many ESOP shares they may accumulate, and kind of show the economics to key management. And then lastly, we will always summarize, did an ESOP actually accomplish the goals you set out to achieve, which, in this case was keeping the company, independent, getting a fair price, providing a benefit for key management, all of that. And certainly this did check all those boxes. And I know we're right up against time, but we do have a 4th code word, so I'll let you go ahead and enter that. It's ownership.
And we got some good questions in here that we're not going to be able to answer in this hour, unfortunately, but we will certainly follow up with answers later.
Right. No, I know we had to rush a little bit through those last few slides. I'm sorry about that, but hopefully you get the point, though. Hopefully you got a good feel for what type of information is included in the feasibility study. Certainly, if you're interested in ESOPs, reach out to us. Happy to discuss whether a feasibility study makes sense for you. Happy to talk about your specific situation. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining. If you're interested in getting the slides sent to you, I think you can reach out and we'll send those to you. And otherwise, have a great day. Anything else, Joe?
I don't think so. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.